Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Brown, Executive Director of the John Bradamus Center at New York University. And welcome to day 2 of Inside American Politics 2020. For those of you who joined us yesterday, great to see you back again. And for those of us joining today, welcome. Yesterday, I'll give a quick reprise of our main points, very quick. We talked about what happened in the election and why. In fact, there was a theory of the case for the election brought forth by both candidates. Joe Biden, return to normalcy, stop fighting, and let's just get on with the business of governing. For Donald Trump, it was let's keep disrupting, let's find and rile up the base a bit, and actually let's expand the base from 2016. Both kept pretty much to that theory of the case. Biden's prevailed, but it was an amazing, consistent approach. It turned out the electorate also had a theory of the case. And while they gave the top nod, they gave the nod to the top person to Joe Biden, down ballot was a different story. And there seemed to be a propensity among the electorate to want to balance out a Democratic win at the top with Republicans holding their own or even gaining at the state and local level. The second panel of yesterday was on polling and social media. Turns out polling, which we knew all along, is both an art and a science, maybe more sciencey now than arty. And the panelists discussed a lot depends on what questions are asked, of whom, and when they're asked, and on by what media or platform. And it's probably best to layer in all of these methods to get to an idea of understanding where the electorate is at. On social media, well, it seems here to stay. Should it be regulated? Can it be regulated? Is it up to the industry to monitor itself? Is it up to users to inform themselves? Or is it up to the market itself, and will it find its own way to correct some of the distortions? So with that, we're ready to enter day 2. Let me introduce Ellen Toscano, who will introduce the panelists, and we'll get going.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. Welcome to the second day of Inside American Politics Conference. This is our 13th consecutive year that we've gathered together to discuss the national elections. As Lynn said, my name is Ellen Toscano. I'm the co-founder of this series and an advisory board member of the Bradamus Center at NYU, which is hosting this convening. As Lynn said yesterday, we had a rich discussion that laid a great predicate for today's panels on the future of both parties, what challenges each faces going forward as they look to work in Congress and beyond to the 2022 and 24 elections. As always, we've assembled a great bipartisan group of campaign experts, practitioners, journalists, and academics, and look forward to their insights. Before we go to the first panel, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to my co-convener, Steve McMahon, my partners at the Bradamus Center, Executive Director Lynn Brown, and Deputy Director of Programming and Outreach, Tom McIntyre, and our programming partners, Federal Hall with its program called Debate Defends Democracy, the Brennan Center for Justice, and NYU Votes. Finally, some logistical notes. We'll leave time at the end of each panel, hopefully the last 15 minutes, for questions from you, the audience. Please use the Q&A box. We will not read bios in the interest of making more time for the panels. They are on the website of NYU DC, and a link to the bios is in the chat. So with that, I'm pleased to turn over the proceedings to the moderator of the third panel, Kiki McLean, who is a leading public affairs and political strategist and currently the director of the Walton Family Political and Communications Office. This panel will address the future of the Republican Party. Has Donald Trump permanently reshaped the party in his image? How does it move beyond 2020 and build a national coalition to compete in 2022 and 24 presidential elections? Kiki.
Great, Ellen, thanks so much. And to Lynn and Tom and the whole crew, we really appreciate the chance to be here and have this kind of a conversation to continue learning, particularly this week. I have a really simple question for our panel today, and I'm just going to round robin right through you. And we'll start with Todd, go to Michael and Rob, and then Jonathan, I'd like you to give your assessment on this question after we hear from our three leaders from the Republican Party. It's a really simple question. Todd, who's in charge of the Republican Party?
Well, first, thank you for having me next year in Athens, as the expression goes. I would say it's pretty clear who's in charge of the Republican Party right now. It's the same people who were, or the same person who was in charge last week and last year, and that is President Trump. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but it's important for people to understand that the attraction that so many Republican voters have toward or for the president, it's not a political connection. It's not even necessarily one based on policy or economics. It's cultural. And the fact that the election is over doesn't change the sense of attraction that they have for him. And so I think it's probably going to be a very long time, whether it's months or years, before there is really another faction of the party, although I think that the level of infighting will just under the surface is probably going to be pretty intense. And secondly, just a simple point, you can't replace something with nothing. And right now there is not, while there are disparate voices, there is no one single person or one movement that has shown any capacity at all to viably challenge the president's standing in the party.
Right. Michael.
Thank you. It's great to be with everybody. Exciting times. And, as the Chinese proverb goes, may you live in interesting times until you realize that's actually a curse, not a blessing. It kind of puts it all in perspective. Now, I think Todd put his finger on the animating principle, such that there is a remaining principle for a lot of the GOP under Donald Trump, is culture. That was his segue, his entree onto the national platform. It is something that he has himself been very much a part of shaping long before he got to the nomination of the Republican Party in 2016. People forget that Donald Trump, as a culture warrior of sorts, was in people's living rooms for 14, 15 years every week, talking to them, showing them his bravado, his machismo, firing people in these sort of fake scenarios, and creating this sort of reality TV genre that defined him. They saw him hosting beauty pageants, so he was always surrounded by these beautiful women. So when Access Hollywood comes out, there was not this cultural breakdown in a negative way for him. People just kind of say, well, yeah, of course, he's in beauty pageants all the time. What are you talking about? And so, Donald Trump was able to do something in a very creative way that had not been done. He made his viewers into his voters. And that in large part is because of those cultural connections. His opposition to the Central Park Five, for example, the 5 African-American and Hispanic men who were charged erroneously for a murder in Central Park, who were, subsequently found to be innocent. Donald Trump was still stoking some of those cultural memes around young Black men, violence, protecting whiteness in New York's Central Park. And so a lot of these themes and memes translated politically. And that's why you see this sort of rise of this sort of white national, populism around comments from Charlottesville to Proud Boys, where he doesn't put it down. He doesn't do what is culturally expected of a president in dealing with these types of issues. He either embraces it or he sort of soft pedals it. And that plays a lot into some of the lasting remnants of the Southern strategy from the 1960s. And so I think, to Todd's point, this is a culture war. I mean, whether it's around family values, the gay marriage situation, abortion, for example, whether it's around other issues that touch on the nature of this society in the modern era, he has a ready audience. He is an avatar for that audience in many respects. And again, to Todd's point, I think it's going to be very difficult because you can't undo that unless there is a movement, not just by one leader, but a number of leaders within the party to wrestle that back and to retrack the party into a new future and a different future where culturally the country will continue to change. It is going to look a lot more like me than Donald Trump. And so that reality is something that is going to be hard for Republicans to unhinge themselves from, or more importantly, move into, because of how they're staking themselves right now to a lot of what Trump has put out there.
Rob, do you agree with Michael that Michael and Todd, that it's still President Trump in charge of the party, regardless of where the election outcome is as of today? And is that ground in, and this may be a false choice, culture or politics?
I think
Rob?
Today, in this moment, we see a sitting president as leader of the party. Where it's going to be in 2 years is anyone's guess. I think the important thing that you have to understand, and I think it is culturally, in a sense, in the Republican Party, we've always been a fractious party. I know Democrats say the same thing, but it's always been a challenge. In 10, 12, 14, the amount of energy we spent as a party just trying to come together to face the Democrats was unbelievable. And I think in 16, you saw the spectrum of factions on display. I think we had 17 candidates and Trump won. And so you asked me who's in charge. I mean, the grassroots are in charge. They rejected some very popular, everyone in Washington, anointed, and I joined a different campaign. And, every obstacle was put in Trump's way and he steamrolled the entire establishment. And then he came to DC and he did the same thing. And, but let's not forget, he got the most votes of any Republican president. He got the second most, it appears, of any candidate ever. He took on big media, big tech, and he still got, almost half the nation to say I'm with him. We can sit here and debate style all we want, but my point is, the Republican Party is a bigger party than it's ever been. It's been more diverse. We've seen an explosion of rapper endorsements of our national candidate, which has never occurred in my lifetime. And I say that as kind of a joke, but also as kind of a sign that, we've always represented more people at the poverty line in the House than the Democrats have for the last 10 years. And something along the lines of 4 million more people at the poverty line or lower. And maybe our party is changing. I mean, if you're Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, I don't know if I know who our base is anymore. I don't know if I know who our governing coalition is anymore. And that's maybe a good thing. Maybe country club Republicans are becoming juice bar Democrats. I don't know. And I think it's going to take us a few months to figure that piece out. But what I can tell you is there's an energy, there's an openness that I think is really exciting. We saw a lot of voices who never have spoken on YouTube and Twitter across the spectrum who came out for Trump. But when they talked about Trump, they also talked about a core Republican message. And I think it was really an exciting election. It was candidly, we're going to find out it's a losing election. But then you look at what happened down ballot, and I think the reverberations of this election are going to be for the next decade. Redistricting is not going to be what it should be, which is, in my professional career, we've always had a Democratic president during redistricting. So that's 20 years. And this year we should have got washed out, just if you look at history, and we didn't. You look at the House, we saw, gains in suburban seats, but also in Hispanic, Donna Shalala losing, I think is a really interesting development in the Republican Party. And as Haley Barbour always teaches you, it's never as good as you think it is. It's never as bad as you think it is.
Yeah.
So I don't think we need to sit there and say, we're a brand new party. No, but for the first time in a long time, new audiences said, hey, I'm going to listen to the Republicans. Yeah. And I think that's a huge opportunity. And I think all these new voices fit inside of the coalition of people who voted for Republicans. So I don't know. I know we don't have a lot of answers today because it's just so new, and with so many people voting by mail, exit polling isn't exactly where we probably want it. But I actually feel, compared to the 12 loss and 10, that we're, as a party, actually in a much better place, regardless of whether Trump is gone in a month or a year. Yeah. The amount of people who said, I'm willing to listen, is there, and we just can't lose that moment now. And that's really what I think is incumbent upon all of our leaders and all of our future presidential candidates, to sit there and say, what are the lessons of Trump? Trump asked folks who aren't a part of the coalition for their vote. Bernie voters, African-Americans, Hispanics, he actually said, would you consider voting for me? And I think that's important. I've heard that said a lot of times. We have to go to these communities, but no one ever does it. And I think that's great. So I'll stop.
Well, it's interesting. And just for our audience, Donna Shalala is still a member of Congress from Florida, former HHS secretary under President Clinton, was elected last cycle. So, and went on to become a university president and then elected last cycle to the House. So I just want to make sure everybody knows who she is. But Jonathan, as we kind of wrap up the who's in charge concept, Rob's put something on the table. Is it Trump or is it the grassroots? Because in fact, if you remove the gains by Republicans, and for those of us who live and die in campaigns, we know that to not lose can be a real gain, right? And women, not just the voters, but to his point, who got elected? More women got elected this year in the Republican Party. There's some significant gains there. So, Jonathan, is it President Trump? Is it the grassroots, or is somebody else in charge of the Republican Party right now?
Sorry about that, Kiki. Thanks. Great to see everybody, even though we're not in Athens. I think in the short term, the leader of the party is President Trump, but we will see, I think, in the long term, if it really is the grassroots. I think the way you laid it out there in your question, Kiki, argues that maybe when we go to 2022, 22, 24, 26, then we'll get a clearer answer as to whether it's the grassroots of the Republican Party. I'm still trying to figure out now, since this is the Republican Party and President Trump, I'm hard pressed to say, what exactly does the Republican Party stand for anymore, other than the basket of horribles that we know about, given what the president has done over the last 4 years. To me, it's kind of troubling that, one, it's great that Americans in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and independents felt so strongly about having their voices heard that we've had the biggest voter participation in I don't know how long, that both candidates have received more votes than their predecessors in terms of nominees of their parties ever. But I do find it disconcerting that President Trump was able to get, if I had the number here in front of me, I think it's almost nearly 9 million more votes than he got in 2016. And this is after jailing babies at the border and separating them from their families, coddling white nationalists, whether it's in Kenosha or Charlottesville, a whole host of running roughshod on the rule of law. There are a whole host of reasons why he should not have gotten as many votes that he did, but he did. And I think this gets to the thing that Chairman Steele was talking about in terms of the political war and cultural war that we're in right now. And I think that's what I'm more curious to find out in terms of, is it Trump or is it the grassroots?
Yeah.
Who really is the voice within the Republican Party? And Rob was saying, that voters were saying, I'm willing to listen. I'm curious, what were they listening to? And how much of what they were listening to were the dog whistles, and how much of it was listening to maybe their own self-interest in terms of tax cuts, or how much of it was listening to some kind of governing philosophy that to my ear, I never really heard.
Well, hey, Todd, I want to frame this because this leads right into a question I had. And, you're one of the best media and message strategists in the country for either side of the aisle.
Thanks.
And I think one of the things that we're hearing here is to Rob's point, we have a lot of analysis to do. We don't have all the data in yet, right? We got a lot to learn over the winter about what happened here. But if you look forward, not just backwards, if you look forward at what a national coalition looks like, or what you think it could look like now, what is the message? To Rob's point, what were people listening for, and what would be that national coalition? What would be the message structure for that coalition moving forward for the party at the national level?
Let me take a step back before I answer that. I'll address one of the things that Jonathan was just saying, and it leads Kiki into your question, and I'll repeat something that I had said yesterday. There's an economic theory called loss aversion theory, which states that that people who have something currently are far more likely to, or are far more protective, and their feelings about it are far stronger to hold on to what they already have than someone who doesn't have something and is trying to get it. And so if you apply this economic theory to politics, and you think about white working class Americans who, for a couple of decades now, when you talk about real wages that are going down, and this is a group of people who were hit disproportionately hard by the recession in 2007, 2008, people who lost everything and watched on Wall Street as not a single person was held accountable for what had happened. These are people who economically and culturally, they disproportionately are people of faith. And because they are white, rightly or wrongly, they see an America changing around them. When you do focus groups, you hear people saying things with white working class Americans. You hear people saying things like, "I'm a stranger in my own country now. I don't recognize the America that I live in." And all of these concerns have been exacerbated by the rise of political correctness, the woke America, the cancel culture, the riots. Trump spoke to this group of voters in a way that no politician in my lifetime has. And the overwhelming majority of these people who supported Trump did it because they believed that he was like the last line of defense for the America that they know and love. Now, people can say that they're wrong. They can disagree with their thinking, but that's the reason.
Yeah.
Very, very few of these people even know what white nationalism means. They don't follow the ups and downs of politics the way that we all do. They viewed President Trump as someone who was giving voice to their concerns, to their fear that that their way of life was slipping away. So with that as a context, to me, it's ironic because a president who arguably has been the least ideological in decades has actually given birth to some of the most, on purpose or not, some of the most exciting policy and ideological developments within the Republican Party of my lifetime. When you've got candidates talking about the need to completely restructure how we as Republicans talk about manufacturing, to completely change the relationship that Republicans have with Wall Street versus working class Americans. This idea that you can separate populism from nationalism. They don't have to be connected the way that that they have been over the last several years. The idea that the federal government should take a more activist role in helping companies, particularly in manufacturing, to compete globally. That would have been, you'd have been run out of town 10 years ago if you had suggested something like that. And today you've got quite a few Republican leaders who are actually talking about some of these things. And so what's the future of our winning coalition? Well, I hope, and Rob mentioned this before, I hope it is a wide and disparate coalition that is built on working families.
So I just want to clarify, one of our audience participants has asked to restate the theory, and you were referring to the loss aversion theory.
Yeah, and so the simplest way to think of loss aversion theory is if I were to offer you, Kiki, if I were to say, hey, I've got $1,000, let's flip a coin, you get to call it. If you win, I'm going to give you this $1,000, but if you lose, you have to give me $1,000. All of a sudden, the prospect of this exchange starts to diminish, most likely in your eyes. And they've actually calculated that for most people, you have to get up to like 3x, 4x, or 5x, so you have to get 5,000 to make it worth it for you. And so if you take that idea and apply it to politics, if the theory holds, it would suggest that voters who are voting in order to preserve something that they already have are going to be 3 to 5 times more motivated, whether it shows up in the polls or not, than voters who, in this example, let's say a progressive Democrat who is voting because they want to change, they want to create something, and they want to create an America that doesn't currently exist.
Right.
That would be the theory.
Right. I want to hit on 2 things because some of our audience members are raising it. It was one of the things I wanted to ask about. And let's talk about what that coalition moving forward looks like, right? If you have this message frame, I always think it's interesting, right? With that staff frequently, or operatives will frequently say, or voters will say, I believe this, you're like me, you shouldn't believe the other way, right? So when people look at, and to the point that exits are kind of early and we're not quite sure what's in them, if you look at the increase in African-American men supporting President Trump, right? And what does that mean for the future of the party, the coalition of Cubans and LGBTQ? And I think it's important that no political strategist believe that they should assign where someone should be. But do you see those signs? I want to talk to Rob and Michael about that in that coalition. And then Michael, when we come to you, I'd like you to pick up the issue of what does it mean to have charisma in that candidate? Again, you raised that the cultural function of a leader of the party. So Rob, why don't we start with you about what do you do really to build the diversity of the coalition? Or did you see bigger signs of it this time, like you mentioned?
Well, I mean, if you said a week ago or a year ago that Donald Trump was going to lose ground with white men and pick it up with African American and Hispanic voters. I think everyone on this panel would have laughed me off the stage and said, get out of here. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say I've crunched the numbers. This is intel I've gotten from conversations I've had with the Trump campaign that were Thursday. So if it has changed, I apologize. But that, I mean, that was their initial read of what really happened. And there seems to be some House of Representatives that factors in and reinforces that theory. So how do you grow the coalition? I mean, I think there's a compelling message that Trump had, which is, and Kim Klacik had in Baltimore, which is, in her commercial, she talked about the most dangerous place for a minority is a Democrat-controlled city. That was her message, not mine. And I think it resonated with folks. And, you know, Trump often said, what do you have to lose? You know, his and I think Republican candidates' message of opportunity over handouts, probably said better than I say it, but I'm just saying, I think that had a resonance and it gave us an opening to begin a discussion with a population or populations that, you know, generally didn't look towards Republicans for solutions. And I agree with Jonathan in many ways that the rhetoric that came out of the Trump campaign and the candidate, if you were Hispanic, if you were new to this country, if you were Muslim, and if you were African American, was deeply troubling. Yet it was interesting that, at least statistically speaking, a group of that vote moved towards Trump, despite all this, despite all these. And I don't know if that means, like I said earlier, that the parties are realigning on economic and education terms, that they're realigning based on the messenger, and maybe things go back to where they were. I think if you're the Republican Party, the hard thing we have to realize is, and we're seeing it play out in North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas, is, you know, this is going to be a game of inches from now on until our coalition reforms. And we're going to have to fight hard for every election. And we're going to have to realize that the idea of, you know, base plus one voter, is a questionable outcome, but we're going to get outspent every election. We have been for the last decade, but it's going to get worse, and we need to accept that. And so that means we need to be smarter. And in our messaging, we need, instead of saying we need 50 plus one, we need to go to a broader message that appeals to everyone, even voters who may not look like our candidates or may not look like your classic Republican voter. And the good news is that in this election, Republican after Republican show that they can penetrate those voters if they're willing to put in the work and if they're willing to have a message. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity. And you know, I think our next presidential candidate could take the best of our national message right now through Trump and through the Senate and through the House and really distill it into a powerful coalition. And I think some of the voters we lost, they were style voters. They were the voters who were turned off by the tweeting and the divisive comments and, you know, things like, you know, a long-serving senator who was a war hero and we wouldn't put the flags at half-mast, things like that, things that my relatives bring up with all the news that came out of Washington the past 4 years, that they would. So the question is, could you build that coalition back up? And I think it's a huge opportunity. And but it needs a leader who has an aspirational message for everybody. And I think that is, for me, what I always, you know, the threads you could weave between winning campaigns, you know, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, it was always aspirational, their message, and brought everyone in. Hope and change, make America great again. I mean, those are messages that everyone nods their head and says, yeah, that'd be great. And we fill that void with our own personal biases, what that means to have hope and change and to make America great again. But it says everyone's welcome. Yep. And I think that's the tendency. And it also reflects on the political class. We have to run campaigns that are broader, more nuanced, more sophisticated. And I think that's going to be hard because I think the political class tends to go to what worked, even if it worked back in 1998. They want to go with what the last winning race was. I think that's part of the challenge we have as grassroots leaders and as elected officials, is to push on this moment.
Michael, you're former chairman of a national party. You've had the job of holding the coalition together. You're a statewide office holder. You've run for office. You've won office. So looking forward into the party, what does that coalition look like for people running down on the ballot? And does that culture, charismatic leader nationally, what does that do to that coalition build? We've got no volume from you, Governor.
Oh, sorry about that.
There you go.
It's yeah, I muted myself. It's a lot to unpack for sure. Both Todd and Rob touch on some points that are at once important, but also I think kind of speak to some of the problems that the party is going to have going forward. Having won in a state that's 2-to-1 Democrat, having moved the electorate enough to have 5 Democrats endorse me for the United States Senate back in 2006. The coalition building effort is one that is an important aspect of what Republicans have to do. My philosophy has always been, as a county chairman, as a state chairman, as national chairman, as a candidate for multiple offices, has always been about how I build that coalition. And I learned that, ironically enough, from the former mayor of Washington and Marion Barry, where I grew up. And having walked neighborhoods and actually, as a Republican, a Black Republican, look voters in the eye, particularly from my own community, who would very quickly close the door in my face. But making that effort to build that coalition, you don't do it through hot rhetoric. I mean, there's, people making a big deal. Oh, Black men, 18% of Black men voted for Donald Trump. Well, you have to understand, Donald Trump has had this dance with Black men going back to the 90s. This is nothing new. It's nothing new. There was no movement here. This is the same sort of hip hop, machismo, misogynist sort of rap narrative he played into. They bought it. Hello. All right. But he still only got 8% of the Black vote. George Bush got 11. And so the reality of it is how you move the needle. I can play to that base that's already there, which is exactly what Donald Trump did. There was no movement needle here in that sense, in terms of where we see Hispanic and Black men in particular. That same sort of machismo narrative. So how does that then expand your coalition if once you take that character out of the mix? Who's, to your point, Kiki, who's going to be that person who stimulates that conversation? When you look at the Kasich race in Baltimore, I wouldn't hold that up as an example of anything. She got 28% of the vote, which is what a Republican in Baltimore City gets. That message was not for the people of Baltimore. She wasn't talking to the people of the city who were offended by the message. She was talking to a broader white national audience, which paid for that message. And so we have to understand exactly what the dynamics are. This is not a one size fits all. This is not, this narrative will apply to everybody. Grassroots organization and building is a very finely tuned metric. You have to drill in, you have to knock on that door and you have to confront the voter, but you have to do so in a way in which they appreciate, first off, you're being honest with them. And second of all, you have something to say. Donald Trump did not make a case for his reelection to the country. And if he did, I'd love to know what it is, because I don't know what he did not run on his economy. He did not run on the regulatory reforms that he made. He did not run on the things that my two colleagues here referenced in terms of manufacturing. I didn't hear a manufacturing argument to the country that was at least sustained. He may have referenced it when he was in Ohio or in parts of Pennsylvania, but that wasn't a message that was carried into Philadelphia. Wasn't a message that was carried into Arizona. So the question becomes one of narrative, and then who gets to carry that narrative? For me, what I'm looking for is on the other side of Trump, And by the way, he's still going to be a factor. Whoever is going to try to emerge is still going to have Trump on this shoulder and that shoulder in their ear, and tweeting out a different narrative, because Trump is not, his character is not one that goes away once the series is over. You know, it's just, that's not how it happens. And so there are going to be a lot of variables, and I think it's going to be very difficult for the party to reestablish that kind of conversation. When I inherited the party in 2010, with Barack Obama sitting at 71%, a donor base that had gone back to Texas with George Bush, a grassroots that was pissed off that would eventually form itself into the Tea Party. And I'm sitting there going, okay, so how do we win the governorships in New Jersey and Virginia that November, let alone what do we do in 2010? And there's a reason why I got on a bus, because you have to carry that narrative. You have to state very clearly. When I go to the NAACP and speak to them, I spoke to them about the values of being a Republican, those ideals, those Lincoln-esque ideals that we believe. So the question is, who's going to carry that conversation if those values still matter? Now, if they've been changed by Trump, where the only thing that matters is not the character of the individual, the values they hold, their behavior, or all these things that are a little bit more ephemeral, and it's just about, I got a tax cut, or I got a Supreme Court choice that I like, or I like your plan on manufacturing, then that will be a dramatic shift, because the party's always married its values to its policies, as opposed to just going out and saying, this is what we believe. That's part of the cultural conversation, because those cultural conversations are around those values. So I think this is going to be a much more of a mixed bag going forward. And I don't see a leader emerging either in the Trumpian field or outside of Trump, or the mainstream Republican field yet, to carry that message, whatever it is.
Okay, let's take a shift about halfway through in our conversation. You know, normally you'd look up and say, well, they're what appears to be an outgoing administration. Why would we spend all our time talking about the person leaving office? I think there's general agreement. He may be leaving office, but that doesn't mean he's leaving the stage, right? Number one. I think Rob has established, maybe if you were the Time Magazine editorial director for Person of the Year, it might be the grassroots of the Republican Party, Rob, right? That there is something they're seeding, formalizing, a new kind of coalition, not to be yet defined. Jonathan, let's talk about who the other players are, right? Because if President Trump either filled a void or took a cultural or charismatic opportunity, right, regardless of whether he's on this stage or not, come midterms with gubernatorial elections, other potential candidates, whether President Trump decides to run again or not, if he is not in fact remaining in office, who are some of the personalities in the Republican Party who show leadership potential, and what are the kinds of issues and topics they are known for or would be engaged in? Who do you see out there? And then maybe Todd and Rob and Michael could talk to us about some of those folks a little bit.
Well, I'm going to leave the leadership specific names to the three Republicans on this panel. But as you were asking the question, which is a legitimate question, who comes after Trump? Who is on the bench? Who's the bench of the Republican Party? And I'm going to take the argument I used during the Democratic primary and apply it to the GOP. During the Democratic primary, you had all those candidates, 20-something candidates at one point running for office. And you had two who were African-American. And everyone kept focusing on them and saying, well, why aren't they're having such a hard time getting the African-American vote? And I kept saying to people, you don't understand. As long as Joe Biden is in the race, no one is getting the Black vote. And so now I'm applying that mindset to where the Republican Party is right now. As long as Donald Trump is active, doing rallies on Twitter, doing everything that he does right now, but not doing it from the Oval Office. And when he's done it over the last 4 years, he has sucked all the oxygen out of the room for anyone else. He's the leader. and everyone and everything. And I would love for, you know, Rob and Todd to disabuse me of this notion, but everything is going to revolve around him within the Republican Party. Already, we have watched for 4 years Republicans who criticized him during their own run for president, even one senator who had his wife insulted and his father insulted, and yet that person is with President Trump, because these folks are living in fear of anything he might say, either on Twitter or at a rally, because the president has such a hold on the base of the party.
So Jonathan, to your question, Rob, let's talk for just a second, because by the way, it's not just President Trump, right? You have some years in service in Mitch McConnell, right? You could argue that Kevin McCarthy, as the leader in the House, I wouldn't exactly call him new generation, but it's not as though he's been in that role forever. Where is the oxygen for that next generation, Rob? And who are the people you look at and say, new coalition, new generation of Republicans coming together? Here are some people who might lead that.
Well, I mean, I think presidents are a totally different animal. I mean, Bill Clinton was so popular and had such high name ID, it allowed his wife to run for Senate and eventually for president. Barack Obama.
I'd say she ran on more than just her name, but okay.
Yeah.
Well, it opened a lot of doors. Can we agree it opened a lot of doors?
There was definitely fame, but go ahead.
And I think during the chaos of the Democratic presidential campaign, the thing I heard from my Democratic friends the most was, man, I wish Michelle Obama would have run. So my point is, when you invest a few $1 billion behind brands in America, they have a tendency to stick. We can look at the Bush brand, we can look at Obama, Clinton. So your answer is, why, Romney, has a whole new life in the Senate, but part of that was because he ran as a national candidate and had high name ID when he moved to Utah. So, you can't discount, you can't sit there and say Trump is some analogous or unseen force before. We've seen this before, but as the times shift and move, you see that there's room for other brands to emerge. And I think that's it's an unknown time right now what the future is. Does Trump run again for re-election? Does, or I guess, I don't know if re-election is the right word, but
I don't know what the technical would that be.
Yeah, there's kind of like, I guess, election.
Again. Again. But who are those emerging brands? Who are those startups?
Well, I mean, I think you saw a lot of you saw a very young, diverse ticket in 16. They were not successful, just like the Democratic ticket in 20. But I think a lot of people position themselves both on the Republican and Democratic side to be voices for the future.
Do they have a chance to help lead in the next 4 years? Is there room for them?
Well, absolutely, because you look at the Senate stocked with young leaders who've all moved up. They've all, they, instead of being third and fourth on the committee, they're either leading the committee or they're number two. We as a party have gotten better, bigger data. We finally are starting to crack the nut of online fundraising with WinRed, and that provides opportunity for everybody. I mean, will we have an Andrew Yang type candidate? I don't know, but the opportunity is there because the windows are there. That you can build a national movement online. You can, through fundraising and through your comments and statements. So it provides a ton of opportunity. And so, I mean, I'll let Todd talk about how Marco Rubio is going to be our next nominee.
Rob, we can't get you to name names. So we're going to have to get somebody to name names.
Well, I mean, I don't think you have to look very far. I mean, let's just go right down. Let's go right down the Senate dais. I mean, you have Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, all have run before, all have gotten experience. You look at the history, especially Republican politics, generally you have to run a few times and get it right before you get it right. You have Tim Scott, Rick Scott, both, important voices for our party. Rick Scott just became National Republican Senatorial Committee chairman. He's going to raise a bunch of money across the country for the next 2 years. That's good for him. I'm
What
probably
about
forgetting,
women?
but-
What about your women governors? Nikki Haley, what about?
I mean, I was going to say, I'm just running down the Senate, so give me pause. Joni Ernst ran a hell of a campaign against a tough opponent, and she emerged. Great backstory, unbelievable, and you know, super accomplished. And then yeah, you look at Nikki Haley, you look at our governors. You know, I think Michael Steele's governor is looking like he's going to leave more popular than he came in after 2 terms and you know, some really tough challenges facing the state. You know, we have, you know, Vermont, Massachusetts, Texas governor. I mean, we have a huge bench, and I feel really good. What this election proved is that we can get outspent, but we can put together the resources that we need to run national campaigns. I think the RNC and the party apparatus really worked well to develop our data techniques. I mean, you're not hearing that there was a grassroots turnout problem. I think the national door knocking program, we got our backsides kicked in 12 on national door knocking. We thought we could rely on technology, and that's really become a DNA of our campaigns, where you see campaigns that are, you know, spending $2, $3, $4, $5 million in the on year just on knocking doors, and that's a great development. I think we have a great bench. The question we have to answer is, what kind of party are we? Are we the Trump populist party? Are we the Romney Ryan kind of globalist, you know, national world leader party? And we've always had those tensions. You know, the isolationist wing of the party is always been there. It subsided after World War II, and is it back? You know, are Republicans going to be free traders? Are we going to be kind of more in the Trump Bernie Sanders protectionist mode? I mean, we have a lot of questions that I don't think anyone can answer right now, but that's why we run campaigns, and that's why we put people forward.
Can I just
go ahead, Michael?
Go ahead,
Can I just jump in real quick? Because I mean, Rob, you touch on something that's very, very important. And I really think, despite everything else that this conversation has moved on to, you just put your finger on a critical part when you say, what kind of party are we? Are we a Trump populist party with all of his attendant features? Or are we a Romney party? Are we this? Trump beat all of those people.
Right.
How do they then claw back for him after Trump has added 9 million new voices to his side of the ledger, not theirs, his side of the ledger? They couldn't win with McCain. They couldn't win with Romney. So how do they now claw back that number of voices and support towards an agenda, unless that is a Trumpian agenda? And that's where Trumpism wins, because at the end of the day, and it goes to what Jonathan's saying, what you're looking at, if this election is certified the way it is now leaning, Trump will become a former president with a Twitter account. And so nothing really changes in that regard. His messaging, his characterization of not just Biden, but Republicans who are trying to reject Trumpism. You think if Marco Rubio suddenly breaks out, particularly given what he just did at the end of this election for Trump in Florida, you think he's now going to make a 180 and turn into that wind? I just don't see it. So that's, you raised for me. I mean, I'm not looking for a direct answer, because I think it's going to be hard to answer. It's going to play itself out. But I think you raised the fundamental question in the way you posited just now.
I don't agree with that, Michael, because first off, you know, on Kim Klacik and other voices, we can't have it both ways. We can't sit there and say there aren't enough minority voices, and then when we have minority voices that got funded to the tune of $9 million nationally, they don't count. I mean, we can't have it both ways.
But don't miss my point. Let me just throw on that point. She got funded by national money. She didn't get funded by the people in Baltimore, where she was running in the 7th Congressional District. That's my point. So she still got.
You just described every Senate Democratic candidate this year, Michael.
She got 28% of the vote. She didn't change the numbers. I know the city. She didn't change the numbers. That's my point.
But
all right, hang on. You gotta let Rob answer.
You just counter as a voice when I'm saying we need to elevate these voices if we want to be a broader party.
But what are they saying?
But you raise a good point, and the only reason I disagree with you is this: Barack Obama was president 4 years ago, and the party that Joe Biden inherited was much different than the party he left it. The party of George W. Bush is not the party that Jeb Bush ran to become the head of. So these things, they change. We saw the Republicans radicalize after the Tea Party movement. I think everyone would agree that the Democratic Party is more liberal than it has been in the last 10 years. And they don't have a name for it, but it's more progressive. I mean, it's not Tea Party, but it's more progressive. So I think you're seeing these evolutions and these changes. And whether Joe Biden is a 1-term or 2-term president, the person who inherits that party, it will be the party of Biden, but it will also change, and it can change as quickly as we've seen it. I mean, Barack Obama, I think, would, in many ways, when he left office, we could not have predicted the rise of Trump, but then also the rise of the progressive movement, which has injected millions of people and billions of dollars into politics that we just never seen before, and enthusiasm and excitement, and the great thing of all these conversations we're having and the rise of social media is we had the highest, incredible voter turnout. Everyone always at these conferences bemoan the lack of participation. We don't have that problem now, and it's because people are engaged. And so is the party of Trump going to be the party of Trump in 2 years? I don't know, but history says no.
So let me take us one step. One of our friends in the audience has said, isn't the concept of using brand diminishing to candidates? And I just want to take a moment to say, brand is also shorthand. A brand simply defines a relationship between an entity, a person, and an audience. And so everybody has a brand. I'm actually somebody who believes, having staffed 2 vice presidential candidates before, that when they say, well, they're better known, and it's like, well, today with media and technology, people are known overnight. Amy Klobuchar's number in the Democratic primary went up overnight. I want to come back to Todd before we leave this issue of new leaders who may not be new to the inside, but might be new in terms of taking a significant leadership position moving forward. Todd, you heard some of the names Rob put out there, and you obviously know some of them closely and work with them. Talk to us about your take on some of the new leaders and what that kind of relationship might be like with what could be a new and growing coalition of the Republican Party.
Well, I think Rob cycled through most of them. There's no secret out there in terms of who these people are. I don't like making predictions because I'm always wrong, but one that I do feel pretty good about is whether it's next year when we are all gathered for this or in 2 years, my prediction is that we're going to spend a big chunk of time talking about a Republican that is going to come out of one of the states who is not involved in the federal government at all. And we're going to spend a big chunk of time talking about whoever that person is and what their future looks like,
right,
as a leader. It's been 20 years since we first elected a governor, a Republican governor, 16 years since the re-election. I'm not counting the nomination of Romney just because he hadn't been governor in a while, and he largely kind of repudiated much of what he, in his 12 campaign, he didn't exactly run on his record in Massachusetts. The kind of policy debates that excite me within the Republican Party, one of the reasons why I loved working for Jeb Bush when he was governor was because so much of sort of cutting edge Republican policy making happens on the state level. And so there's going to be someone out there that we're not even talking about. And I would just say, as far as there's no question that Trump is sort of like the sun right now, and it's very hard for anyone else to be seen. But going forward, as long as you're not, well, what the media desperately wants and is waiting for is like the large scale repudiation of Trump from the Republican Party, and it's just not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
So like everyone
I'm
should
not waiting for it.
It's like waiting for Godot.
Yeah, just accept it. Get over the fact that it's not going to happen. Now, that does not mean that contrary voices aren't going to rise. That doesn't mean that voices who talk about different policies, or maybe even talk about the same policies, but talk about them in a different, more inclusive way, those voices will rise, can rise, and they won't be in conflict at all with Trump. And then there will be like a free market of ideas, and we'll see, assuming that Trump stays active in politics, which I think, is a fair assumption, but we'll see, we'll see what kind of audience there is for that.
Hey, Jonathan, why don't, the Democratic Party in the late 80s and early 90s of the previous century, I can't believe I just phrased that way, had a battle over the soul of the Democratic Party, which looks really minor now compared to what Republicans are. That's when I was on staff at the Democratic Leadership Council. We were the resistance within the Democratic Party. It was the rise of the moderates. For anybody who wants to, there's a terrific documentary out there called Crashing the Party about what the DLC did. And it's a great thing to watch. Far less about a fight between extremes than you might see in the Republican Party. Talk about what happens now, regardless of an individual like President Trump, but what happens now for what might be, the last 4 years, people have thought of the resistance as progressive and Democrats. What happens with the role of the resistance in the Republican Party? What happens to the Lincoln Project Republicans? What happens on the other end with QAnon? I mean, these are extremists and don't necessarily represent the mainframe of populism either, but you got a lot of different cubbies of people attaching themselves or wanting to be a part of it. Is there a resistance, and is there some dialogue to be had with the future of the party?
You're asking me, Kiki?
Well, you talk to a lot of sources on both sides, and what happens when is there going to be a lay down fight in the party, or will it be, as Todd, was it you who said inches? Election, Rob, the elections are going to be by inches now.
Look, I think the person who's more qualified to answer that question is Chairman Steele. But what I would say is, it is going to be fascinating to watch the fight within the Republican Party, such as there might be one between the party of Trump that exists now and that coalition of so-called never Trumpers, Lincoln Project, Republicans like Governor Hogan, who have stayed true to their Republican leanings and what the Republican Party stood for pre-Trump, and push back against what's happening within their party. I think that the fight within the Republican Party is going to be a continuation of the fight that we've seen with the rise of the Tea Party. Whatever, and I guess we're going to be talking about the Democrats in the next panel, but whatever battle that is going to be waged within the Democratic Party pales in comparison to what's happening and going to happen within the Republican Party. We can talk about AOC and President Biden, progressives versus the moderates. What we're talking about, though, in that fight is, we're talking about gradations here. Everyone within the Democratic Party believes that climate change is something that needs to be addressed. The battle is over. Well, how do we do it? I think as an observer, that fight is much more interesting to watch because they're actually talking about real things. They're talking about policies that help the country, in this case, and help the world. Whereas in the Republican Party, they've got rational Republicans like Governor Hogan. Then you have President Trump and all of the folks revolving around, that son. And then you have the new people coming in who've walked through the door as a result of what President Trump has done. And that's to your point, Kiki, about these QAnon person, these so far right people who are coming into Congress that I'm wondering what part of the flat earth did they rise up from? They used to be the fringe, so fringe, no one wanted to pay attention to them, give them any kind of access to power, and now they're coming to Congress.
Yeah.
And so for me, the fight in the Republican Party is much more interesting, but it is also much more, it's much more vital, because even though no one will believe this, I want the Republican Party to be strong. I want the Republican Party that I grew up with under 2 terms of Reagan, a term of HW, and 2 terms of W. I want that party to come back, because that party stood for something. That party pushed for those ideals. I didn't agree with a whole lot of it, but at least with a strong Republican Party, the Democratic Party had a worthy adversary, not in a pejorative sense, but someone to battle with in terms of ideas that in the end, the goal is to help the country. And right now, that's not, to my mind, that's not the Republican Party.
Well, let me get it. I want to ask Chairman Steele to comment on this in a particular frame, and we're going to get ready to open it up here. And Chairman Steele, I guess my question, the evolution of what Jonathan laid out here, is the real game to watch the primaries for the Republican Party in the next cycle? Is that where the game's going to be?
Actually, to a certain sense, yeah, because that's where you see certain manifestations of it, of the battle. But I think that to Todd and Rob's point, and actually, I don't want the audience to be confused. We're actually, the 3 of us, in much more of alignment than it may sound on a lot of this. And that, I think, goes to what Jonathan is talking about, is how do you then begin to position or articulate the repositioning of the party in a post-Trump era. I think that's what a lot of us are going to be waiting for to see. Who does begin to emerge as the setup for the 2024 cycle begins? Regardless of the outcome of this election, you're going to have Republicans running for the presidency in 2024. And they're either going to run under a particular banner known as Trumpism, or they're going to run under some hybrid of it in which they sort of cheated a little bit, where they stay a little bit in favor with Trump, not piss him off because he ain't going anywhere, but also sort of kind of bring in some of those more traditional musings of the party. So you're going to see, I think, a lot of that play itself out in the primary for sure. But it is going to matter what we say to the American people. We still have a lot to account for. We were the party in the minds of a lot of Americans who put kids in cages. We were the party that said to the Proud Boys, stand by. So there's going to be a lot that we're going to have to account for with our candidates as they begin to refashion themselves. And that, I think, is where a lot of this battle is going to take place, in sort of elbowing themselves into a position to be the leader or leaders of a particular style and form of republicanism, whatever that is, in a post-Trump environment.
Well, why don't we take, Todd, go ahead.
Well, I want to add one quick point, stating rather the obvious here, but no discussion about the future of the Republican Party and what it looks like and sounds like would be complete without some talk about what the future of Fox News is going to look like. Because if Fox News decides, or at least on the opinion side, that that Trump is the leader of the party, then it makes it a lot harder for other voices to emerge. If they treat Trump as a leader of the party and create some space for other people, then it will be easier for some of those voices to rise up. So that I think is going to be a big part of the story.
Right.
As well.
Or frankly, with other social media platforms where people choose to isolate in community and say, we don't like this platform, let's go over here. Doesn't matter if it's not about wrong or right. It's about a community saying, hey, we're going to huddle up over here and have our conversations here. Let's take this opportunity to invite all of our other panelists to join us in the conversation and broaden the conversation a little bit. I've tried to track questions from our friends out in the audience to make sure we're hitting the topics. I'm going to be honest with you as a moderator, I'm not going to get into what President Trump's future legal status looks like beyond the election. I think that's a lot of time wasted for this conversation. So I appreciate people's thoughts, but I'll let everybody have that conversation at their own happy hours. And let me ask some of our other colleagues here, is there something you'd like to pose to our team? I see Lisa Benenson is off mute and she's got a thought she wants to raise.
So over the last several days, since the election, really, the president and the leadership of the Republican Party have refused to accept the results of this election. They've thrown around allegations of voter fraud with zero evidence. I would like to hear from my Republican friends and colleagues here. Do you refute these allegations? And do you think that this gamesmanship damages the Republican Party long-term?
Well,
Anybody want to volunteer? Thank
yeah,
you, Chairman Steele.
Yeah, I'll start on that. I do not buy into the allegations because I'm looking at the numbers that are coming out in the states that are still counting, and noted that I said still counting. So allegations of fraud and corruption are, to put it politely, premature because they are still counting votes, and typically. If you have, during the process of that count, identified and discovered such fraud, you present that evidence immediately in order to get it stopped. I think 11 attempts have been made to do that, and every court that has been presented has basically said, get out of here. There is no such evidence. So there is that. Again, what I've been hearing and talking to various folks around town, a lot of this, and this is an internal battle right now inside the White House, a lot of this is being pushed by Rudy, who's been out front on behalf of the president and the president himself. There are others who have a more sober view of this because of the brand. In fact, reported just before we started our panel today, reporting from the White House is that a number of folks are trying to get the president to appreciate what his legacy could be in a post-presidency. So versus, going down this particular road only to have it be, refuted by the courts. So I think it's not getting me on. It creates a lot more dissonance at a time, particularly while in Arizona and Georgia, votes are still taking place, counting rather, and I just think that it's one more dissonant chord for the American people in terms of how they look at our voting process, and that's unfortunate.
It's interesting, Michael, when you talk about the legacy and some of President Trump's team members trying to talk to him about what his legacy could be. If you applied that to what Rob said to us earlier in the conversation about the expansion of the party, having had more wins than anybody else, there's Mr. Benenson. We could hear you on your audio, Joel, so we can hear you if we can't see you. I think that's an interesting point for him that, I can't ever think of a time when there's a president who may have lost the election, but still had huge gains to report as part of his legacy. Take a turn to a question from somebody in our audience who raised it. Rob, you've done so much issues and legislative work over the years. Is there a role for a Jeb Bush kind of lead on an issue like immigration? Is there room moving forward in the Republican Party to get back to the kind of collaborative work when Lindsey Graham was at the table for climate change and immigration and some of that?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it before. Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, Jeb Bush, W. Bush.
But will they come to that table now with the voter base that turned out this way? I think maybe the question.
Well, I think the question is, it takes two partners to get this done. So I think there's always been significant frustration, and I think I can let Todd speak to it from being there firsthand, that Republicans have sometimes taken on their own party and in some ways stepped out and risked only to, we saw with Harry Reid, just not a huge desire to work with the president. Now we can dispute that, but it's been if you talk to Republicans, especially Republicans who worked hard on this issue and have gotten beat up on this issue. It's a very frustrating issue because there have been gangs of 6 and 8 and 12 who have worked on this issue only to see it slip away. So I think there's a huge desire to fix immigration. And I think if you look at where the Republican base is, it's not that they're anti-immigration. I think there's just a sense of anti-legal immigration, and I think it splits along a number of concerns, be it economic. If you're downscale voter, economically speaking, it's a hard place to hear that, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce gets to decide, prevailing wages because of labor markets. But if you're in the central coast of California, you want to have an option to have seasonal labor come help, and you want a solution there. If you're a high-tech company, you want to have access to the brightest minds wherever they may be, and you want them to come to America to work. So I think there's always been a lot of options. It's just a matter of will, and it probably speaks.
Well, but Rob, in fairness, under the last administration, you had a president who's pretty hard line on it. And yeah, I mean, I think the question is their political.
The previous Republican administration before that, you had a president who went out, who really tried to solve this problem, and I think expended a lot of political capital. So, these conversations.
I think that's the question: is there political room in the Republican Party for it right now?
I think.
I think an equally germane question is whether there's room in the Democratic Party for a solution. Will the progressive wing of the Democratic Party allow its leadership to pursue a position that would be acceptable to Republicans?
Right.
And I think that's an open question as well.
Right. It's a fair question. We're just focused on the Republican Party right now. That's all. I mean, I'm not trying to pick one side or the other.
No.
Because I think Rob raised something interesting, that you've had 2 Republican administrations who have been in different places in terms of how they approached the issue, right? And Rob said, one spent a tremendous amount of political capital on it.
They did. Just real quick on that, and Rob's right. The Bush administration did spend a tremendous amount of capital on it, but the reason that capital was ultimately wasted was because of a base that said no and turned on Bush and put pressure on McConnell and others in leadership. They didn't stand with the president on that. That fight did not reach its natural conclusion, where you had, to Todd's point, where you had Democrats and Republicans aligned on the immigration back at the end of the Bush, in the Bush second term. To get that issue done. There was a general will on Capitol Hill. Everyone kind of agreed in principle. The Gang of 8 and all the other gangs that were attendant to the immigration issue was there. That got scuttled because a base said, hell no. And so whether it's anti-immigrant or not, whether it's we just want legal immigration or not, the base was the one that kind of drove the nail in that coffin. And I think that's something that for the Rubios and the future gang of 7, 6, 9, or 20 looking at the issue, they're always going to be looking over that shoulder as long as the base perceives immigration to be something not in their particular interest.
Right. So Todd, with this expansion of Republican voters, expansion on both sides, right? Where are the young people in the Republican Party? What does that look like? What does the future of the young people in the Republican Party look like?
Are you talking about young Republican leaders, or are you talking about young
voters? Young voters. We have somebody asking out of our crew here.
What do you mean? What does it look like?
Well, is that sustainable? What did the vote look like this year? And is that a potential sustainable growth path?
No, I don't. It's not sustainable if it stayed on its current path. But I don't think that there's any reason to believe that it has to. I think that a lot of the excitement that we saw this past election cycle, I'll just speak for my own personal experience, some of the candidates that we were able to field across the country, Republican candidates in their mid-30s or early 40s who were putting together coalitions of young supporters, both Republicans and independents. That was a real bright spot this cycle. Obviously, if you continued the level of atrophy that we've had with young voters, if that continued for another 10 years, anyone can do math. It's not sustainable. But they said the same thing, if I was saying the same thing 4 years ago about Hispanic voters. And if we kept losing Hispanic voters the way that we had been, that wouldn't be sustainable. And you look at what happened this cycle and you see that there is a path and there is a message, a Republican message, a conservative message that can broaden the base of the party to younger voters, to people of color. And so, no, it's not presently sustainable, but I think that, and as we've talked about at length today, the future winning coalition of the Republican Party is going to have to take that into account.
So, Chairman Steele, you're from a state that's got sort of a serious urban center, and you've got a big chunk of your state is rural. And I think some of our folks in the audience are curious about the rural vote and what the issues are that are important to rural voters and how that comes into play shaping the future. Is it what it's been historically, or is it a different kind? Is it the trade issues? Is it the, is it the environmental issues? How do you begin to look at what role the rural voter plays in a future expanding Republican Party?
Well, and it's such a great question because I think as Republicans, we have such a great opportunity to have this conversation. Because folks just have this view of folks who live on the eastern shore of Maryland, where we have this, these wonderful farms and our watermen. Most people know them as fishermen. They're watermen here in Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay. Then you head out west into Western Maryland, where we've got the mountains and we've got, these wonderful communities of people. Their interests all align around issues of the environment. Maryland farmers are very much concerned about the environment. In fact, one of our leading HBCUs in this space, the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, has been using teaching and training the use of technology and environmental strategies to help farmers improve their crops. Right, and this is something that we when I was lieutenant governor, we took to the continent of Africa to share. So this is, we can take these principled ideas that we have around, economy and market forces and all of these things, apply them to certain policies and demonstrate them, I think, as Governor Hogan is. It's why the man got elected with 70+% of the Democratic vote in a state in which we're outnumbered 2-1. It's why, you have this alignment around these issues where we can lay out not just a conversation and just say things, but actually demonstrate it through our policies. So when you look at Maryland, from its beaches to its mountains to its the inner city of Baltimore to its exurbs and suburbs, manufacturing, environmental issues, healthcare issues, conservatives in this state are just as tuned into those issues and concerned about them in a conservative place like the Eastern Shore as they are in my county of Prince George's County, which is a majority African American, the wealthiest Black county in the country, and very, very liberal. And yet you find that you have a governor like Larry Hogan, a governor like Charlie Baker, and others who've been able to create a conversation through the public policies that they put in place that have undergirding them a lot of the conservative principles and ideas that Todd and myself and Rob have been fighting for and promoting for years. So I think it's a great space for us. I just don't want to see it, to put it bluntly, to get Trumpified.
to get it narrowed down to a situation where a Governor Hogan has no voice because he's proven his success. He's gotten Democrats and others to listen to his message. So we got to pay attention to what those governors and those currently elected Republican officials are saying in a way that's moving the needle for the Republican Party in a very positive direction.
Steve?
Yes, I have a question I've been dying to ask this panel. Thank you all for being with us today. There was a rumor as recently as this morning that Donald Trump is already thinking about running again. So my question is, if Donald Trump runs again, will anyone run against him in the primaries in 2024? Will the Republican Party clear the field for him, or will folks challenge him? And if so, who do you think that would be?
Why don't we have Mr. Well, let's ask Mr. Capehart first, and then we'll check in with our three Republicans. I think this is a great closing question, don't you?
I'm just laughing at Todd. I'm watching my brother over there in the corner. And
The answer, of course, is all of Todd's clients want to run.
Yes.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Jonathan, what are you hearing from your sources, Mr. Capehart?
Look, I go back to what I said before. As long as Donald Trump has a Twitter feed and access to an audience, he's going to take all the oxygen out of the room. And I think it was either Rob, or it could have been Todd, one or the other. But you were talking about this sort of the tradition in the Republican Party of the people basically
Multiple
who have run
runs.
before.
Multiple runs. It was Rob. Multiple runs. It was
Right,
Rob.
right. Multiple
Ronald
runs. Right. Or John McCain. So, I could see Ted Cruz running again. I could see Marco Rubio running again. I could see any of those because there were so many of them. I could see any of them running again. The question is, would they dare if Donald Trump is seriously considering running in 2024? Would they dare if they've been attacked by him in some way in the run up to that? I don't know. I have no idea who is going to run. Heaven help them if they decide to do it, if Trump is also thinking of it.
Yeah. Well, we'll do lightning round as we speed it along here to keep everybody on schedule. But Rob, take a shot there.
I think if you take the lesson of the Republican Party, we're a fractious bunch. The Republican Senate sent bills that Trump hated. Senators wrote books. They criticized him. He had a $70 million anti-Trump Republican run operation. I mean, my point being is you got to fight for it. And if, to Jonathan's point with technology, if you don't have to be the anointed one, and there were other anointed ones in 2016 and they got smoked. So whether he comes back is, his choice, and whether he can, come back, that's his choice. Like I said, Nixonian comeback, it has happened before. Yes, it has. But he's gonna have to fight tooth and nail for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of our audience made a comment about what's to keep Trump from Trumpifying the party again. And I guess, Governor Steele, before we go to you, I'd say, well, it's not, again, he hasn't quit. He's not out of the leadership. But quickly, what's your point to Steve's question?
Yeah, so I think if Trump decides that he wants to do round two, there may be some folks who get in the primary, but how do they challenge him? How do they distinguish themselves from Donald Trump? What do they say? You didn't do this, you didn't do that. And how does that win them the nomination against Trump? So let's just be honest. If Donald Trump decides he wants to run in 24, the deck will be cleared for him. And anyone who gets in is only getting themselves set up to run subsequently. And again, that's a risk because they will have ticked off enough people for challenging Trump in the second round. And we're already seeing this morning reported by CNN that Don Jr. And Ms. Guilfoyle are making moves inside the RNC. I've been hearing for a couple of weeks now, because the chairmanship battle is coming up, that the Trump faction has already identified who they would like to be the chairman, who will likely be the chairman. So if Donald Trump wants another ride, he'll get it unabated.
Yeah. So Todd, we'll let you wrap us up here, and I'll give control of this screen back to Ms. Toscano.
So the correct answer is that no one has any clue. It's likely that if he were to run again, he would run largely unopposed. But political parties, as we have seen, as we have all had a front row seat to, our political parties are very dynamic creatures, and what they look like in 2 years is rarely what they look like 2 years after that. And so the one thing that I do know is that he's not going to tell us what his plans are
Right.
for a very, very, very long time. And that will suck every bit as much oxygen out of the room as if he were actually going to run.
Got it. Thank you. Ellen, thanks so much for the panel.
Well, thank you all for a really fascinating conversation. Judging from the robust activity in the Q&A, we had a very engaged, maybe sometimes enraged audience, but a good balance between Democrats and Republicans, I think. So moving on.